next to it. This road goes right by it. Big smokestacks. Detroit Edison. Right here. Here we are. Detroit Edison. Detroit Edison. And I think I'm gonna turn around. I don't want to go in there. I'm very close to the city of Monroe. It's just, maybe a mile from the downtown. This is Detroit Edison, and they have a lot of storage facilities, storage containers. High voltage power lines. And of course, trucks running in and out. There it is. It's right on the water. Easily accessible by boat. This is a major highway that goes near here.
Fermi 3 and other reactors in the Great Lakes Basin generally. Contention 6 asserts that the ER omits information regarding impacts to the western basin of Lake Erie in particular. And contention 14 alleges various other cumulative and indirect impacts were not considered. All three of these contentions are inadmissible for the reasons we discussed in our response. The application actually does contain a discussion of cumulative impacts. The proposed contentions are adequately supported, and petitioners have not demonstrated that any additional analysis would lead to different conclusions than what is already in the environmental report. Turning to the specific questions proposed by the board in the interest of time, you're correct that the baseline assessment of environmental conditions in the region near Fermi 3 does provide the starting point for the cumulative impacts analysis. You've got to start somewhere, and you start by looking at what is the baseline of the environmental conditions in the area near the plant. This necessarily takes into account all of the other reactors that are upstream to the extent that they have any impact on the environment near Fermi 2 or 3. As well as any other reactors on Lake Erie to the extent that they have an impact on the environment near Fermi 2. The petitioners have provided no information to suggest that there are any types of impacts that were not considered or that were ignored or not taken into account. They haven't provided any information that's adequate to support a contention on this alleged omission. The board also asked specifically whether this baseline would include the potential impacts from Davis-Besse. And as I indicated, yes, to the extent that there are any impacts to the environment near Fermi 3, those impacts are already considered in the baseline assessment.
Can you clarify for me that I believe there was some place in the ER where you said something like you weren't anticipating any radionuclides in the effluent from the reactor during operations, but nevertheless you did an analysis of that, I believe because it was required by NRC guidance of some sort. Am I off base on that, or is that?
Yeah, I think you're mixing a couple of things, but this is addressed in the discussion of effluent discharges, and so it does fall within this a little bit. The ESBWR is designed to be a zero discharge facility, so that is correct. Nevertheless, the applicant, even in calculating our various effluent characteristics, we have taken into account and conservatively modeled various discharges in order to provide a bounding or a analysis of what the effects would be of the operation of Fermi 3. So yes, we have taken those into account.
Now how does that factor, if at all, into the cumulative impact analysis? In other words, did you look at other sources of radionuclides that contribute to the Great Lakes and how the Great Lakes or Lake Erie or the western end of Lake Erie might be affected by these hypothetically generated radionuclides from Fermi 3?
Yes, they're taken into account, but it's implicit in the environmental baseline. NEPA is subject to a rule of reason. That is when you're evaluating what is the geographic area over which you're going to look at the impacts from a proposed action. You draw the line based on where you think those impacts are likely to have some sort of consequence that you can measure and evaluate. So for the environmental impacts of water discharges, you take what is in the, you do monitoring of the lake in the area near Fermi 2, and you look at how that would be impacted by the additional discharges from Fermi 3, and also what is the ongoing amount of water and discharge that are coming from any other facilities, not just nuclear facilities, not just coal-fired facilities, but all activities in the basin that have an impact on water quality.
What would be, it seemed to me, looking at the environmental report, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, that the focus of the cumulative impact analysis was an area near Fermi 3. It didn't seem to extend much beyond the immediate vicinity of the western end of Lake Erie that you'll be discharging to. And so I guess my question is, number one, is that correct? And number two, what's the justification for limiting the cumulative impact to that particular area?
Yes, that is generally correct. The immediate vicinity that's discussed in NRC guidance for performing cumulative effects analyses for water-related discharges is 7.5 miles. So that is the immediate area that we looked at. But that's not to say that that is the extent to which these impacts are considered. Obviously, if there were additional discharges that influenced the area near Fermi 2 or Fermi 3, those would be considered and taken into account. Now here, we didn't identify any additional impacts. There's no mixing between the thermal plumes from the Monroe coal plants or even from the Fermi 2 plume with the proposed Fermi 3 plume. So we did implicitly look at those, and there are no other impacts that we've identified that needed to be taken into account. And that brings us back to the contention admissibility standards, which is, have the petitioners demonstrated that the analysis is inadequate in some way? And here they haven't. We've defined our region of interest that we're going to look at, consistent with NRC guidance, subject to the NEPA rule of reason, and we haven't heard anything else that would cause us to question our conclusions in that regard.
Is the site for that NRC guidance in your brief somewhere? If it is, though, you'll need to find it.
It's in New Reg 1555. I'm not sure the precise citation within there, but it is on the section regarding cumulative impacts. So I think that's maybe 5.3 is perhaps the cumulative impacts discussion of operation.
Is that the response to the petitioner's challenge that the region was defined arbitrarily, or is there more to it than just the guidance that the NRC has provided to the environmental report? It seemed like in the environmental sections of your application that depending on the impact you're looking at, you had some basis argument that, at least in my mind, would quantify the region of interest. And I think these contentions hinge an awful lot on how the region is defined to evaluate the impact of a particular parameter. And I don't know if the answer is that you use what is the guidance, then fine. But if there's more, I guess we'd like to hear it. To the best you can communicate or summarize it.
Certainly. And as you mentioned, that guidance that I was referring to specifically dealt with water discharges. The geographic scope you might look at might be different for different types of effluents or activities. But with respect to that in particular, the starting point was the 7.5 mile vicinity that is recommended in the NRC guidance. That is supplemented by professional and technical judgment as to whether there are any other impacts that needed to be considered that have an impact or have the potential to be impacted by the operation of Fermi 3.
Is there any expectation, looking at this long list of proposed reactors, and we've heard about power uprates on Lake Ontario, new reactors on Lake Ontario, is there any expectation that those need to be considered as part of the environmental impact, of future proposed facilities in the Fermi environmental report?
No, there's not. Those are too far from the site to have any geographic relevance to or impact relevance to the operation of Fermi 2.